Hey everyone, sorry it's been a while since the last upload. Good news though, starting to start a proper schedule and got a few games I need to edit and record the voiceover for, so there should be a good load of battle reports coming up. Also, I've signed up to a TTS tournament. I think there's something like 120 players, and we've been split into groups of 5 for the group stages. I'll go into that more once I upload the first game of that group stage, and it's going to be against Vanguard Spearhead Raven Guard. For this game, it's myself playing Traitoris Lance, and my opponent playing Star Dancer Mask Aeldari, pretty much known as the Harlequin detachment because, well, everything is based around Harlequin units, and my opponent's army consisted 100% of these units. As a Chaos Knights player, when you see this, you're going to be quite happy usually. Toughness 3, 1 wound bodies fall like flies, and perfect targets for the Havoc launchers. However, my opponent had his infantry and transports, providing them some level of safety for this game. As always, at the beginning of the game, I have a look at which units are going to be the problem, and in this army, it's pretty much just the Skyweavers. They have a 2-shot, anti-vehicle 3+, AP -1, 3 damage cannon, and can be brought in units of 2 or 4s. My opponent brought 3 units of 4 for this game, which instantly made me decide that no matter what, those were going to be what I had to focus on the most. Fortunately, he has very little lethal hit capability, and the biggest melee threat comes from the devastating wounds that the Troop Master provides his unit of troops. For this game, we were playing UKTC terrain with Search and Destroy deployment, Inspired Leadership as the mission rule, which didn't really factor in this much, surprisingly, and the Terraform primary mission, which rewards performing an action to do said terraforming on an objective marker you control for 2 victory points per objective that you keep gaining even if you end up losing that objective later in the game. As a deployment, Search and Destroy can be your best friend or your worst enemy. For example, against World Eaters, you're in for a very miserable time if they get first turn. It's still so probably even if they don't. The short distance between the 2 deployment zones is what they love to see. Against armies like Death Guard, it's quite nice for us, as it gives us the opportunity to spread out across the board and cage them in a bit more and get onto objectives early, uncontested due to our faster movement. So for deployment, I had my Stalker just turn the home objectives sticky off the bat. I had measured his movement with his Skyweavers, and unless he flew them over the terrain, he wouldn't have been able to get line of sight and be in range of any of my units after his movement. Where this deployment slightly favoured me was that with the 14-inch movement and the Knights of Shade stratagem, it gave me a very real possibility of getting within a good charge distance of the Skyweavers that actually sat right next to the wall. So as you can see, I made sure I had one Carnivore there ready to capitalise on that if I end up getting the first turn. Apart from that, I lined the rest of my Carnivores up in a way that gave them clear avenues towards objectives, or be able to be in a good position to take back an objective, again through utilising the Knights of Shade stratagem. I tend to keep my Brigands slightly to the side of my Carnivores when first deploying, allowing me to peek out behind terrain, choosing targets carefully without fully exposing them to unnecessary threats. As you can see, he had his offensive vehicles in positions ready to push out, and I'd imagine hopefully take some ground, and be in a good position for the round after, as well as having his transports being close by to follow up, and to deposit infantry where they need to be. His Skyweavers, his main threat in this game, were positioned close to major gaps in terrain, which would allow him good lines of sight to most of the midboard. So he rolled for deployment, and I was fortunate to win the roll-off, so I was going first. I think we both knew off the bat what the initial play would be on my side, so all that was left would be to see which secondaries I drew, and that would determine how the rest of my initial turn would go. I drew Containment, which is going to be fairly simple, and Established Locus, which I think I had good potential to score, but would depend on how much I wanted to push on my other War Dogs. In the end, I didn't go for Established Locus. I think it must have been confidence in the matchup and being aware that this initial charge would cause a lot of disruption in his lines, but also being aware that dice are dice, and there was a possibility nothing goes through, and then any War Dogs in the open are at the mercy of being targeted. With that, I pushed a Carnivore up in a position to charge the Skyweavers, as well as another behind the terrain to the left. Then I advanced 2 other Carnivores, one to the top left to sit on that objective, and one to the bottom right to do the same on that one. The reason I wanted to be on these objectives early is that with the disruption in the centre, I was hoping that would almost force the rest of his army to go out wide, and to try and counter my aggression with some of his own, which in turn would allow my Brigands to make the most of their weapons. The good thing for us, and the bad thing for Harlequins, is that the infantry are toughness 3, and the vehicles are toughness 6, which are very key breakpoints for us. That means that our chain cannons are winning on 2s against the infantry and 4s against the vehicles, and then the spears, if they actually hit or wound anything, if you're a Chaos Knights player you know what I mean, wound the vehicles on 2s. Also, the Havocs winning on 3s is also very nice to see. Finally, 2 of my Brigands were doing containment, so that left 7 War Dogs ready to shoot the Havocs in the following phase, and in doing so actually took out 2 more Skyweavers in a different unit to one I ended up engaging with. Into the charge phase, and I got the charge off against the Skyweavers, which ended up resulting in 2 dead and me consolidating back onto the objective in the centre. Was I hoping for more? Yes, of course, but on average it probably worked out about right. I find one of my biggest flaws as a player is that I expect much more damage than I probably have any right doing. I saw some post in one of the discords I'm in about something like, it's not a bad thing to underestimate your own damage output, but overestimate your opponent's, which is something I'm definitely going to work on keeping in mind for future matchups. I discarded Established Locus, and that was the end of my turn, and then it moved into my opponent's. He drew Assassination and Defense Stronghold, so one of those was essentially a given, the other, I believe, a natural impossibility. He started his movement with Void Weavers and Sky Weavers moving up to shooting positions, and one of his troops disembarked a Star Weaver, moving up into the terrain in the top left. I believe my opponent's shooting actually went quite poorly, unfortunately for them, but they still left my Carnivore that fought in the previous turn on low wounds, I believe 4 in the end. In his charge phase, his Troop of 4 and Troop Master charged into the Carnivore, and his Sky Weavers attempted to tank shock charge my Carnivore, which again didn't really work out too well. So it's safe to say my opponent wasn't really too fortunate with the rolls of this game. For the fight with the troop, this was before he fought, and this is after I fought back. In the combat between the Sky Weavers and Carnivore, the end result was one more dead Sky Weaver, and apart from discarding Assassinate for a CP, that was it for my opponent's first turn. Start of my turn, I drew Defend Stronghold and Overwhelming Force. Defend Stronghold, pretty much always a given if drawn early in the game. Overwhelming Force, normally also quite doable. However, not when there's only one objective marker you can try and take, and it's impossible to get to. So in the end, I decided to keep it, as I wasn't going to redraw it. In my head, this was going to be the turn where I was going to try and capitalise on the space gained from my Carnivores through combat, and make a big push out towards the midfield, with the aim of having so many toughness 10 scary war dogs that my opponent wouldn't have enough firepower in the following turn to eliminate the threats, and I'd be able to block my opponent into their own deployment. At the end of the movement phase, you can see someone let the dogs out, and in case you're unable to make it out clearly, the Brigands in the bottom right are in a position to shoot the Void Weaver. If the Brigands somehow fail that, you have the Carnivore there to charge it. If the Void Weaver does go down, then instead it can hopefully get a charge into the Star Weaver behind the terrain, which, although being a 10-inch charge due to its positioning, wouldn't be completely out of this world, especially with baked in rerolls to charge. In the top left, my Carnivore moved through terrain to get charged to his 2 Sky Weavers, and then my other Carnivore moved through to be able to get a charge onto his Void Weaver. I completely abandoned playing for the extra points that Terraform give you, as I realised I could probably end this game early if the pace continued and I was able to keep the pressure on. At the end of the shooting phase, I killed the Void Weaver on the right, freeing my Carnivore up for the charge attempt, as well as killing a few of the troop on his home objective. In the charge phase, everything succeeded in getting into combat. The rerolls came in clutch, giving me the 10-inch required for the charge, and the others were so close to their targets it was just formality really to roll the charges. 3/4 of the combats went fantastic, and one not so much. There was enough CP to interrupt, but the matches were so one-sided that would have been a waste for my opponent to do so, as I don't think there was the damage output on his units available to even bracket my Carnivores. It's always worth keeping this in mind though. If your opponent has 2 CP in the bank, or has a captain or other kind of unit that can reduce a CP cost by 1, or something along those lines, always prioritise your fights. Whether that's by choosing to fight with your flimsy, more vulnerable unit first, if the other unit you are able to fight with is more sturdy and can survive not fighting first in their combat, or positionally, if you know you're in a couple of engagements and it's a situation of whoever fights first will kill the other unit, for example, in a Chaos Knight matchup and 2 Carnivores in combat with one another, you need to have a think about which engagement is more important to win. That would allow you to score more primaries or secondaries perhaps, or would break down one of their pushes and would leave your opponent on the defensive the following turn. Now back into the actual fights. The Carnivores in the top left and middle all did their jobs and slaughtered what was in front of them, with the ones in the top left surrounding what I think may be a Troop Master or Death Jester. I honestly can't remember. I don't even really remember where that thing came from, to be honest. That Void Weaver may have been a Star Weaver, perhaps. Either way, the Carnivore on the right side engagement with the Star Weaver did a grand total of 0 damage, which was fairly impressive in its own right, if nothing else. The turn ended there, and I discarded Overwhelming Force. My opponent started off by drawing Established Locus and Recover Assets, which was swiftly discarded for Containment. His movement was fairly limited due to the stranglehold I had in his deployment zone, but he fell back his Star Weaver. Then the troop inside disembarked, and then the Solitaire, which is in the terrain which my main troublemaking Carnivore charged into at the beginning, got his way all the way to the inner corner of the terrain to the right of where my brigand is in my deployment zone in order to score established locus. After this, the shooting phase happened, and then it ended, and it's the charge phase, where his troop charged into my carnivore and managed to kill it. And that pretty much wrapped up my opponent's turn with the discarding of containment. Onto what ended up being the final turn. I drew behind enemy lines and stormed hostile objective, and at this point it felt like the game was almost cheering me on. I managed to maneuver my war dogs into some ridiculous positions, ready for all manner of shooting and charging brutalities. I was trying so hard to find a way into his troop at the back, but unfortunately wasn't able to do so. Across the shooting and charge phase, I destroyed the Void Weaver, Star Weaver, and 3 of the 4 Sky Weavers. Following that, the game was well and truly over. This was the board at the end of my turn, as well as the score at the end of my turn. We talked out the next couple of rounds. I think I could have ended up on 88 or 91 points. I can't quite remember. So yeah, don't think it's disrespectful to say that this is quite a one-sided matchup. There was a combination of each of our strengths and weaknesses favouring me. The deployment was favourable to me, as was me getting to go first. I think as a Chaos Knights player, we're always going to want to just get involved with the carnivores and then chuck the brigands out there to start popping things with the chain cannon and destroying vehicles with the spear, but it never really works out like that 99% of the time. So when there is the opportunity to play like that, and for it to be in, in quotes, optimal way of playing, it's just so fun. I've played Aeldari a few times now, and they do look pretty scary with some of their weapons, all the fancy movement, etc., but they are so fragile that we can really get the most out of our weaponry too. They're fast, but so are our units, and use that. One quote I've heard is, "We're a fast, fragile, finesse army disguised as a stat check army" by Mike P. It's a very accurate assessment, and don't be afraid to lean into that sometimes. Anyway, everyone, thanks for tuning in for another battle report overview. I'm looking forward to getting some more bat raps out there soon, and I'm also trying to figure out the best way to do a matchups tier list. It'll be a pretty big video, but it will be a fun one. Cheers all, take care.